Imagine waking up one morning, stepping outside with a cup of coffee, and realizing that someone has built an entire neighborhood on your land. Not just one house, not two, but a whole row of brand new homes rising from the soil that legally belongs to you. That was the gut punch moment Mark experienced, and it would change everything. Mark had bought the land years earlier. A wide stretch of green fields, low-lying in some parts but rich with trees and natural beauty. He had plans, maybe a ranch, maybe a family retreat, maybe even selling parcels to private buyers. But for now, it was his sanctuary, a quiet escape from the noise of town. So when he heard the distant rumble of machinery one warm morning, he assumed it was road work. The sound of bulldozers, drills, and cement trucks didn't belong in the countryside. Curious, Mark drove closer. His heart froze. There, across the property line marked by the old oak trees, stood a series of half-framed houses. Workers in hard hats moved quickly, nailing boards, pouring concrete, hauling in supplies. The smell of fresh lumber and wet cement filled the air. He stopped his truck in disbelief, staring as if it were a mirage. "These are on my land," he muttered. The closer he looked, the clearer it became. They hadn't just grazed the edge of his property. The new subdivision, 15 houses by the looks of it, was rising right in the middle of his legally owned land. Rage boiled in his chest. He pulled out the thick folder he always kept in his glove box, the deed, the surveys, the property maps. It was all there, in black and white. No confusion, no gray area. This was his land. And yet, strangers were hammering, drilling, and building as though he didn't exist. Mark marched straight up to the site foreman, who was barking orders at the crew. "Hey! What's going on here? You're on my property." The man barely looked at him. "You'll have to take it up with the HOA, buddy. We're just doing our job." "HOA?" Mark repeated. His blood ran cold. He knew about the homeowners association that managed the neighborhood half a mile away. But what were they doing here, on his land? Without another word, Mark spun his truck around and headed straight for the HOA's office. His mind raced the whole way. Maybe it's a mistake. Maybe it's just a survey error. They'll realize and stop. But deep down, he knew better. The HOA board sat comfortably in their air-conditioned office, sipping coffee, flipping through papers, when Mark stormed in. He slapped his deed and maps on the table. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "You're building 15 houses on my land. I own it. I have the documents right here." The president, a smug man in an expensive suit, barely glanced at the papers. A sly smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "That land has always been considered part of the community," he said smoothly. "We're expanding the neighborhood. It benefits everyone." "Everyone but me," Mark snapped. "You can't just build on property you don't own." The president leaned back in his chair, oozing arrogance. "Look, if you think you can fight the HOA in court, go ahead. But I promise you, it'll be a waste of time. We have the money, the lawyers, the connections. So unless you'd like to join the community and cooperate, I suggest you don't interfere." Mark stared in disbelief. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was theft, blatant, unapologetic theft. They had stolen his land, poured foundations into it, and now dared him to challenge them. His fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to shout, to flip the table, to drag the smug president out by his collar. But instead, he forced himself to breathe. Slow. Controlled. Because in that moment, Mark realized something important. If the HOA wanted a war, they were going to get one. But it wouldn't be the kind of war they expected. No, this was going to be malicious compliance. And when it was over, the HOA would regret ever laying a single brick on his land. Mark's hand still shook as he drove back from the HOA office. He couldn't believe the audacity of these people. 15 houses. On his land. And their president, sitting there, smiling like he'd done nothing wrong. He pulled over to gather his thoughts. What could he do? Call the cops? File a lawsuit? The HOA had a whole team of lawyers and a history of strong-arming neighbors. If he wasn't careful, he could be buried under legal fees before anything else happened. But Mark wasn't the kind of man to back down. Not from a bully. Not from a board of self-important community managers who thought their authority extended to anyone's property. He decided on a more immediate approach: confront the construction site directly. As he drove back toward his land, he saw the workers busy at their tasks, oblivious to the storm brewing on the horizon. Bulldozers rolled over the earth, cement trucks poured foundations, and carpenters nailed frame after frame into place. The smell of sawdust and wet cement filled the air again. Mark parked near the edge of the site and approached the foreman. "I already told you once, this is my land. You need to stop immediately," he said, trying to keep his voice calm but firm. The foreman barely looked at him. "Sorry, sir. We got orders from the HOA. They said to keep going." Mark's eyes narrowed. "Orders from them? Do you have any idea who owns this property?" "I have deeds, surveys, legal proof, it's all mine." A few workers paused and glanced at Mark, but none of them spoke. The foreman shrugged and returned to his clipboard. "They told me to build." "Not to argue," he said simply. Mark felt his blood boil. They weren't just ignoring him, they were acting as though the law didn't exist. It was audacious, infuriating, and downright illegal. He pulled out his phone and called the HOA office again. The receptionist answered. "This is Mark Hayes," he said, keeping his tone measured. "You're building houses on my property. Stop immediately or face legal consequences." The receptionist laughed softly. "Mr. Hayes, the HOA has every right to develop the community as we see fit. Perhaps you'd like to discuss membership? Otherwise, please don't interfere with ongoing projects." Mark slammed his phone into the dashboard. Interfere? He had every right to stop this construction immediately, but the HOA was banking on people like him giving up, folding under bureaucratic pressure. He drove back to the nearest neighbor who had joined the HOA long ago, a woman named Karen. She had a reputation for always following the rules and, more importantly, she had connections. "Karen, this is insane," Mark said as soon as she opened the door. "They're building 15 houses on my land. I've shown them the deeds. I've called the office. Nothing. They're ignoring me completely." Karen's eyes widened. "Oh, wow, that's huge. Are you going to fight them?" "I have to," Mark said. "But I need to be smart about it. They're ruthless." Karen nodded slowly. "You know, the HOA doesn't play fair. But if you can prove it's your land, there might be a way to make them regret this." Mark took a deep breath. He knew she was right. The fight wasn't just about stopping the construction, it was about holding them accountable for every nail, every board, every misstep. And he was ready. He spent the rest of the day gathering every piece of evidence he could: old surveys, photos of the untouched land, property maps, and even testimonies from neighbors who remembered the boundary lines. By evening, Mark sat in his living room, reviewing all his documents. The magnitude of what he was up against was clear. 15 houses. A full construction crew. An HOA that thought it was untouchable. But Mark also realized something else: they had made a critical mistake. They thought compliance with their own plans was enough. They didn't realize that his compliance, done cleverly, would become their downfall. And that's when Mark started plotting. Malicious compliance, yes, but perfectly legal. And devastatingly effective. The first confrontation had ended, but the war was just beginning. The next morning, Mark woke up before sunrise, the distant rumble of machinery already echoing across his property. 15 houses were rising like some grotesque monument to HOA arrogance. Every nail, every plank of wood, every bag of cement reminded him that the board had ignored his warnings, and they were racing against time to finish before he could mount any serious legal challenge. Mark drove slowly along the perimeter, taking careful notes and snapping photos with his phone. He documented the construction crews, the equipment, the foundation work, and even the boundaries they had crossed. Every frame of every house was recorded, every corner marked. If he was going to win, he needed proof. Despite his fury, Mark couldn't help but notice the carelessness of the construction. The land was uneven and soggy in spots, yet the crews were building directly on it without proper reinforcement. Foundations were poured on soft soil. Wooden frames rose on shaky ground. It was almost as if they were daring disaster to happen, and Mark knew that it wouldn't take long. The HOA, of course, had its excuses. "We're under tight deadlines. Don't question the efficiency of modern construction," the foreman had said days ago. Efficiency, Mark thought bitterly, had nothing to do with safety or legality. Neighbors began to gather along the edges of the property, curious about the unusual activity. Some were excited, thinking more houses meant a more developed neighborhood and rising property values. Others, however, looked uneasy, noticing the ground shifting slightly as heavy trucks rolled across it. Mark approached a group of them, introducing himself and showing the boundaries of his land. "This is my property," he said firmly. "The HOA has no right to build here. I'm collecting evidence and planning my next move, but I need witnesses." One elderly neighbor, Mr. Lawson, nodded. "I remember these lines from decades ago. Those trees mark the boundary. They're building way over it." Mark smiled slightly, feeling a spark of hope. At least some residents understood the stakes, and their awareness could be invaluable later. Meanwhile, the construction crews worked at a relentless pace. Cement trucks arrived at dawn, pumping wet concrete into half-finished foundations. Carpenters swung hammers with precision, oblivious to the legal storm brewing around them. Mark walked among them, careful to avoid confrontation, knowing that any aggressive act could be twisted against him. By midweek, 5 houses were fully framed, their roofs partially covered with shingles. The remaining 10 were in various stages of construction, but the pace showed no signs of slowing. The sheer audacity of the HOA was almost impressive if it weren't so infuriating. At home that evening, Mark spread out his evidence across the dining table. Photos, videos, maps, historical property surveys, everything meticulously organized. He started drafting emails to his lawyer, outlining every potential violation, every ignored warning, and every possible avenue for future litigation. But Mark also began planning something else. If the HOA was determined to ignore the law, he could let them continue. Let them follow their plans to the letter. Every cut corner, every weak foundation, every miscalculation could work in his favor. Malicious compliance was now his secret weapon. By letting them build exactly as they intended, without interference, he was setting the stage for their eventual downfall. Every shoddy decision, every reckless shortcut would soon come back to haunt them. Mark paused, staring at the glowing screens and scattered papers. The houses were rising, but the seeds of disaster were already planted. And when the rain came, and he knew it would, the HOA would be forced to face the consequences of their own arrogance. He allowed himself a small, grim smile. They were in a hurry. They were confident. And that was exactly what he needed. The construction boom wasn't just a phase of frustration, it was the beginning of their undoing. By the time the 4th week of construction rolled around, Mark could feel the tension in the air like static before a storm. The 15 houses now loomed across his land, each one a testament to the HOA's hubris and blatant disregard for property rights. But more than that, they were fragile, like paper boats in a river about to rise. It started subtly. A few neighbors noticed cracks forming in the freshly poured foundations. Tiny fissures at first, barely visible unless you looked closely, but Mark spotted them immediately. He walked around the perimeter, snapping photos and taking careful notes. Every crack was another mark against the HOA, a silent confession of their negligence. Then came the water. A series of minor leaks appeared in basements and lower floors. The HOA claimed it was settling, a normal process for new constructions, but Mark knew better. The land was swampy, poorly drained, and weak under the weight of concrete and timber. Water had nowhere to go, and the signs were unmistakable: disaster in the making. Engineers from outside the HOA came quietly, offering consultations. They shook their heads as they measured the foundations, checking soil composition, and inspecting drainage systems. "This land can't support this many structures without proper reinforcements," one engineer said. "The soil is too soft, and the foundations are inadequate. If heavy rain comes, these houses are going to sink or tilt." Mark listened carefully, recording every word. He knew that the HOA would ignore warnings. They always did. Their priorities were profits, deadlines, and appearances, not safety or legality. And, as predicted, the HOA brushed off the concerns. The president dismissed engineers' reports with a wave of his hand. "We've been doing this for decades," he said smugly. "Our methods are perfectly safe." "You're overreacting." Mark clenched his fists. They were overconfident, blind to reality, and that overconfidence was their biggest weakness. Meanwhile, residents began murmuring among themselves. Complaints trickled in about soft spots in the lawns, unusual creaking noises, and floors that seemed slightly uneven. A few brave homeowners called the HOA directly, expressing concern about possible flooding and structural instability. The response was always the same: polite dismissal. "Your homes meet all code requirements. Enjoy your community." Mark watched it all quietly, taking meticulous notes. Every oversight, every miscalculation, every ignored warning would soon be a legal and moral weapon in his arsenal. Then came the trees. A section of his property had old oak and maple trees marking the natural boundary lines. Heavy machinery had damaged some roots during construction, leaving the trees leaning dangerously. Mark photographed each one, knowing that any further damage could become another point of liability against the HOA. At night, Mark sat at his kitchen table surrounded by evidence: photos of cracks, videos of water pooling, reports from engineers, and maps marking property lines. He reviewed everything carefully, noting how each red flag was connected, how each ignored warning could amplify the eventual disaster. And then, he started planning. The HOA was moving fast, but so was nature. The weak soil, poor drainage, and rushed construction meant that they were playing with fire. Mark didn't need to take action immediately; all he needed to do was let the process continue. Malicious compliance had entered its next phase. He would allow the HOA to follow their plans exactly as they intended, ignoring every warning, every red flag, every engineer's report. They would build on their own mistakes, and the fallout would be spectacular. Mark leaned back in his chair, staring at the darkened window. He imagined the day when rain would pour and the soil would finally give way. 15 houses, sinking, cracking, tilting, each one a monument to HOA arrogance. A small, grim smile crossed his face. Their confidence was their undoing, and he would be there to witness every moment. The red flags weren't just warnings; they were the opening moves of a game the HOA had no idea they were playing. It started as a drizzle, barely noticeable at first, but Mark could feel it settling into the soft earth. For weeks, he had been tracking weather forecasts, and today, the skies finally delivered. The storm wasn't massive yet, just heavy enough to test the foundations of the 15 houses rising arrogantly on his property. Mark grabbed his raincoat and boots and headed out. The wind tugged at his jacket as he walked toward the construction site. Already, puddles were forming near the foundations, small at first but growing rapidly with every passing hour. The construction crew worked regardless of the rain, hammering and drilling with wet hands, oblivious to the danger beneath their feet. Mark watched quietly, taking pictures, recording videos, documenting every inch of flooding as it spread across the uneven terrain. The HOA had ignored every warning about the weak soil, and now nature was beginning to prove its point. By midday, the rain had intensified. Water pooled around the foundations of the half-finished houses, seeping into basements and under slabs. Floors shifted slightly, and walls began to creak ominously. Residents visiting the site looked on in horror, some clutching umbrellas, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Mark kept his distance, observing. He knew better than to intervene directly. He didn't need to. Malicious compliance meant letting the HOA follow through on their own reckless plans. Every crack, every inch of water, every failing foundation was now evidence, and soon, it would all be spectacularly undeniable. One of the engineers who had earlier warned the HOA arrived on site, slipping carefully across the mud. He squinted at the foundations, measuring shifts in the poured concrete and noting water levels in the trenches. "This is bad," he muttered under his breath. "The soil's completely saturated. These homes aren't going to hold if the storm continues." Mark nodded silently, grateful he had recorded the warning. This would later prove that the HOA had been fully aware of the risks but chose to ignore them. By late afternoon, minor flooding had become serious. Water gushed into the lower levels of several houses, seeping through weak seals and unfinished basements. Workers scrambled to add temporary barriers, but the effort was futile. The land beneath them was simply too soft, too waterlogged, and too unstable. Residents began calling the HOA office, their voices filled with panic. "Our homes are flooding. The basements are full of water. You need to stop this." As expected, the HOA president's response was predictable. "Please remain calm. All constructions are up to code. The water is temporary. Enjoy your new community amenities." Mark shook his head. Their arrogance was staggering. They treated disaster like a minor inconvenience. By evening, the scene resembled a construction site from a nightmare. Mud clung to every surface, water flowed through trenches like miniature rivers, and the soft soil gave way in places, tilting the wooden frames ominously. The 15 houses were still standing, but barely. Mark stood under his umbrella, watching the chaos unfold. Each crack, each tilt, each puddle was a mark of justice in slow motion. He knew that when the storm ended, the cleanup would be catastrophic. Insurance claims, lawsuits, angry homeowners, the HOA's empire of arrogance was crumbling under the weight of its own greed. A small, grim smile crossed his face. This was exactly what he had anticipated. Their ignorance, their rush, their dismissal of warnings, they had paved the way for disaster. Nature, paired with their hubris, would do the rest. Mark stepped back, letting the rain soak his coat. He didn't feel guilty. He didn't need to. Every warning had been ignored, every legal step had been disregarded, and now, the consequences were beginning to speak for themselves. The storm raged on, and with it, the first real signs of collapse. The HOA had built on shaky ground, ignored every engineer's warning, and mocked the law, and now, Mother Nature was about to make her verdict. And Mark, the quiet observer, was ready to watch the dominoes fall. After the storm, Mark knew the moment for action had arrived, but it wasn't about rushing in and confronting the HOA anymore. The first phase of the disaster was already underway. Foundations were cracking, water had pooled in basements, and the 15 houses were teetering on weak soil. Mother Nature had done half the work. Now, it was time for Mark's plan. Sitting at his dining table, he spread out every single document he had meticulously gathered over the past weeks. Deeds, surveys, engineer reports, photographs, timestamps of phone calls, emails to the HOA, all lined up like chess pieces waiting for a checkmate. Mark had realized something critical. The HOA thought compliance was about following their construction rules and schedules. They didn't understand that he could also comply, but maliciously. By allowing them to build, exactly as they planned, without interfering, he would ensure that every mistake, every corner cut, every ignored warning would come back to haunt them legally and financially. He started drafting a detailed timeline of events. Every crack in a foundation, every pool of water, every unstable structure would be logged with photos, dates, and engineer notes. Each piece of evidence was a bullet in the chamber for the lawsuit he planned to file. The HOA thought they were untouchable. They were wrong. Mark called a few trusted neighbors and quietly shared his plan. "Don't interfere with the construction," he instructed them. "Don't warn the HOA. Just document. Photograph. Record. When the collapse happens, we'll have every proof needed. This is about letting their own arrogance destroy them. Some neighbors were hesitant. Isn't that risky? One asked. What if someone gets hurt? Mark nodded solemnly. I'm not asking anyone to put themselves in danger. But the moment the HOA ignored every warning, they became responsible for the consequences. We're simply letting the evidence accumulate. Justice will take care of the rest. For days, he moved quietly around the property, taking measurements, photographing cracks, and noting shifts in soil and structure. He became almost invisible, a ghost observer while chaos grew. The HOA, oblivious, continued their relentless construction. Workers hammered and drilled, heavy machinery rolled over soft ground, and the president micromanaged schedules like nothing was wrong. Mark also began to think ahead. When the sinking houses became obvious, homeowners would panic. He would have to document their complaints, the HOA's dismissive responses, and the engineer's advice ignored by the board. Every single interaction was part of his malicious compliance arsenal. One evening, as Mark reviewed the photos, he allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. Each crack in the foundation, each bulging wall, each puddle seeping through basements wasn't just a structural flaw, it was proof of their negligence, arrogance, and blind overconfidence. His plan was simple, but devastating. Let them continue building exactly as planned. Document every single misstep. Capture the disaster as it unfolded naturally. Present irrefutable evidence that the HOA ignored legal, engineering, and safety warnings. Watch as the law and justice did what he could not do manually. Mark leaned back in his chair and sipped his coffee, eyes fixed on the site. Rain clouds still lingered in the distance. He could hear faint creaks and groans from the houses, preludes to what was coming. The HOA thought they were controlling the game. But Mark's patience and careful compliance had flipped the script. Their arrogance, their greed, their dismissal of rules, they had built their own trap. And when the inevitable collapse began, he would be ready, evidence in hand, moral high ground secure, and justice on his side. The malicious compliance wasn't about revenge, it was about precision. And Mark was a master strategist. The countdown had begun. It started quietly at first. One of the 15 houses, a newly built two-story with fresh wooden siding, began to tilt slightly. Mark spotted it from the edge of his property, snapping photos before anyone could notice. The tilt was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was the beginning, the first domino in a chain reaction of destruction. By mid-morning, the chaos became undeniable. Foundations cracked under the weight of the poorly supported structures. Water from the recent storm had saturated the already unstable soil, and it had nowhere to go. The ground beneath the houses shifted like soft clay under enormous pressure. Workers screamed as floorboards groaned and walls warped. Some tried desperately to prop up sagging beams, but it was futile. The soil beneath was giving way faster than they could react. One house sank several inches in moments, leaning dangerously to one side. Mark stood back, umbrella in hand, documenting everything. Every crack, every tilt, every sign of collapse was evidence of the HOA's hubris. He had warned them, he had gathered proof, and now nature, paired with their recklessness, was executing the final act. A homeowner, who had recently purchased one of the houses, ran up, shouting, "What's happening? My house, it's sinking." The HOA staff tried to calm her down with empty reassurances, but the signs were too obvious. The ground was unstable, and there was nothing anyone could do. The tilt of the first house triggered a chain reaction. Neighboring houses began to sink, foundations cracking, walls splitting. Windows shattered under stress. Mud and water oozed from under the floors. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and fresh timber, mingling with the panicked voices of residents and workers alike. Mark didn't intervene. He stayed at a safe distance, documenting the full extent of the disaster. Every shovelful of displaced soil, every snapping beam, every collapsing floor was proof of what he had been saying all along. The HOA had ignored warnings. They had ignored engineers. They had ignored legal boundaries. The president of the HOA arrived on site, his confident stride faltering as he saw the devastation. He barked orders, demanding the workers stop the sinking, to stabilize the houses immediately. But it was too late. The damage was beyond temporary fixes. Gravity, mud, and water had taken their toll. By afternoon, at least half of the 15 houses had visibly sunk. Some leaned at impossible angles, while others had partially collapsed into mud and water. Residents screamed, running from collapsing walls, trying to salvage belongings. The scene resembled a nightmare. Mark's phone was full of photos and videos by now. Every angle, every sinking house, every panicked homeowner was captured. Later, these images would serve as undeniable evidence, proof that the HOA's greed and negligence had caused the destruction. He allowed himself a small, grim smile. This was malicious compliance at its finest. He hadn't touched a single hammer, moved a single board, or interfered with the construction. Yet the consequences had unfolded perfectly according to his plan. By evening, the rain had subsided, leaving behind pools of water and mud surrounding the now tilted and sunken houses. The once proud structures looked pitiful, leaning and sagging, trapped in the sticky soil that had been ignored during construction. News crews arrived, cameras rolling, capturing the disaster live. Headlines would soon read, HOA houses sinking on private land, who is responsible? Mark knew he would be asked for comments, and he had already prepared his statement. Calm, factual, legally precise. The story was no longer just about property, it was about accountability, arrogance, and justice served. The HOA had built 15 houses on his land. They had ignored warnings, rules, and legal boundaries. And now, they were paying the ultimate price for their hubris. Mark turned and walked away, rain-soaked and muddy, knowing the final act of the saga was still to come. The houses were sinking, the HOA was panicking, and the stage was set for the fallout that would destroy their credibility forever. The morning after the disaster, the scene on Mark's property was chaos personified. 15 houses, half tilted, half sunken, some partially collapsed, stood as a monument to arrogance, greed, and reckless planning. Mud, water, and debris littered the ground. Workers scurried in panic, trying to salvage what they could, while the HOA board huddled together, faces pale, phones ringing off the hook. Mark arrived early, as he had every day, but this time with a calm sense of purpose. He surveyed the wreckage, noting the precise extent of damage. This wasn't just bad construction, it was evidence, meticulously documented, a perfect record of negligence. Every photo, every timestamp video, every engineer's warning he had collected was now worth its weight in gold. News crews had already begun arriving. The story had gone viral overnight. Headlines screamed, HOA disaster, houses sinking on private land, and residents panic as new homes collapse. Reporters crowded the edges of the property, eager for interviews, cameras capturing the tilt and collapse of foundations in real time. Mark stepped forward when approached. Calm, composed, and confident, he said, I have proof that the HOA built these houses on private property without permission, ignored warnings from engineers about unstable soil, and neglected basic safety protocols. The responsibility for this disaster lies entirely with the HOA. The crowd murmured, nodding in agreement. Residents whispered among themselves, pointing at the evidence Mark displayed, photographs, surveys, timestamps, and documented complaints ignored by the HOA. By mid-morning, legal teams began arriving. Mark's lawyer was ready, armed with months of evidence, while the HOA's attorneys scrambled to assess the damage. There was no denying it, the case was overwhelming. Malicious compliance had worked perfectly. Mark hadn't touched a hammer, hadn't interfered with construction, he had merely allowed the HOA to follow their own reckless plan. Within days, the fallout was total. The HOA faced multiple lawsuits from homeowners, contractors, and Mark himself. Insurance companies questioned the liability of structures built on land that wasn't legally theirs. The HOA president was publicly humiliated, forced to answer for his hubris in local media, and ultimately resigned in disgrace. Residents who had initially supported the HOA's expansion were now furious. They realized that blind trust in the association had cost them both money and safety. Many expressed gratitude to Mark, recognizing that his careful planning and legal diligence had prevented an even greater catastrophe. Mark reclaimed full rights to his land. The 15 sinking houses were condemned, eventually demolished under court order. The soil was tested, boundaries remarked, and fences rebuilt to mark the legal property line clearly. Every attempt by the HOA to reassert control was blocked by courts citing Mark's documented evidence and the HOA's blatant negligence. In the end, Mark stood on a small hill overlooking his reclaimed land. The sun broke through the clouds, glinting off puddles of water, wet mud, and flattened debris. The air smelled fresh after the storm, a quiet peace settling over the chaos. He smiled, not with glee, but with satisfaction. Justice had been served, not through anger, not through revenge, but through patience, meticulous planning, and malicious compliance executed perfectly. Mark knew that he had turned a potentially devastating situation into a triumph. The HOA had overstepped, ignored rules, and underestimated him. By allowing them to follow their reckless plans, he had let their own arrogance seal their fate. As he walked through the mud, documenting the final remnants for his records, he thought, sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't force, it's strategy, patience, and the law on your side. The HOA's disaster became a lesson for the entire community: never underestimate the owner of the land you're trying to take. And for Mark, it was a reminder that patience and planning could turn even the most impossible situation into a victory. And so, with 15 houses gone and justice served, Mark finally felt a deep sense of closure. His land, his rules, and his patience had won the day.